Okay, I'm back. Again, next week I'll have, hopefully, it's coming tomorrow according to Amazon, one of the overlords. I'm getting a whiteboard, little easel, so I'll be writing these big words on the board again, and God willing, spelling them correctly. But for now, you're just gonna have to bear with me and look at my bookshelf, and don't ask me why. But there's a bed frame sitting against it because I recently got a new bed and was trying to sell that to a friend, but now there's a virus, so it's sitting in my living room until further notice. Uh, yes. Back to Gould again. Stephen Jay Gould, renowned science essayist, natural historian, paleontologist. One of the most famous critiques of Darwin, his notion of punctuated equilibrium, that evolutionary change is not gradual, that it can be rapid, relatively speaking. It can occur in a few thousand years rather than millions. And pardon me, I'm drinking a soda. The and back to Gould now, reading another essay of his on human history now called Posture Maketh the Man. And this essay seeks to answer a funny question. And this is often how history of science works. When you study the history of science, what you're really studying is not, what we learn as kids. Oh, Isaac Newton, so brilliant. Oh, Einstein, so brilliant. Oh, Darwin. No, what you're often learning about when you grow up and you study the history of science is how wrong we got it. Not to laugh at the past and say, haha, they were morons, but to show us that even today, it's often the concepts we're working with that prevent us from seeing what's there. Okay? And that we still have that problem of not having the right concepts. We can learn from the past when they also had the wrong concept, but then it was corrected. Okay? And so what are the wrong concepts today? And so on. The main error here. So there was all this speculation after Darwin's ideas, and even before, as they, early people in paleontology were discovering dinosaurs and other, extinct creatures, and they even had to come up with the concept of extinction. They used to think there couldn't be extinct things because God's perfect, and how could God make something that would stop existing? I know that sounds silly, but they even had a theory that like the fossils themselves were rocks trying to turn into matter, into living organisms, and that fossils were this sort of in between. They weren't extinct creatures; they were some kind of in between rock and animal, different sort of existence. It's a strange theory but at the time it seemed commonsensical because the presupposition that God was omnipotent made it impossible to think of creatures going extinct. So anyways, this all falls away, and we start to understand that things did go extinct. In fact, most things have gone extinct that have ever lived. It's like 3% of all living things are now alive. 90-something% are gone. And that should give you some idea of where we're eventually headed. There was a big speculation. Okay, we're gonna find human-like things that preceded us in this fossil record, in this record of all. We're going to find them, and the assumption that was wrong was that first they would find basically something on four legs, right, like a chimp or a gorilla or something, not upright, with a big brain. You would find the big brain first, and then you would find the posture, and the language and the culture and everything. And then it turned out that was totally wrong. That was wrong. It's a famously wrong notion. And it's such a wrong notion that people are like, we have to learn from this. And what do we take away from it? Well, it's a funny thing, but basically we stood up first. And by we, I mean our pre-human ancestors, the Australopithecines, the first upright walking hominids. They stood up, and then because their hands were free, the ability to manipulate things with your hand, and manipulation, literally that same root for in Latin manus is hands. Gould discusses this in the essay. That manipulation of things with the hands led to a bigger brain. It's a fascinating and simple idea that by freeing our hands, we could suddenly grow our brains because of the positive feedback between having all this freedom and dexterity with your hands. Then you could suddenly your brain could grow as a result of that. And Gould hits upon a little known fact about Karl. So Karl Marx is famous thinker, but he's really nothing without Engels. Not that Engels was his equal as a thinker, but Engels had the money and the material resources to promote Marx's ideas, especially after Marx's death. He outlived him by a little over a decade, and he did a lot to make sure things were being published, conferences were being held, that the notions Marx had come up with, which are brilliant, were being disseminated, okay? And part of that was Engels wrote on science to kind of show the validity of their thinking, their materialist conception of history and of reality, that there's nothing but the matter, the stuff of physical and chemical processes, and that could be applied in that they would accept science as they were modern, in other words. Then the bourgeoisie, their enemies, were reactionary, were still being mystified by religion and all this sort of stuff. And Engels comes up with a great argument that Gould points out in this essay, which is, okay, how come all these smart people supposedly miss this concept that, of course, we would have stood up first, started using our hands, and then brains get bigger? Why did they miss this? Because they themselves don't actually work with their hands. They are from the upper class. They're the people who, when they say things, it seems as if from their mere words and thoughts things emerge because someone else goes and does it for them. They are not workers, and so they depreciated the importance of work, of labor, of using your hands, of manipulating reality with your 10 digits and your arms, and therefore they assumed as their life was, so it must have been in the past. Okay, and just because of their class position, they had a bias against the ordinary working person and the importance of human labor to not only our daily life in nowadays, right? When you see, for example, suddenly how important it is who works at the grocery store, and some of you who have working class jobs these days and are still having to go to work because you're considered essential suddenly in the midst of the crisis, when other people like me can just sit at home and spout nonsense into the internet. They depreciated the working man's contribution, the contribution of physical, manual, with your hands labor to our human development, to our development as humans. It's a fascinating topic, okay? And I won't read to you from this, but I will point to actually I will read a little bit. I'll read from the end, and I'll read a quote from Engels here, from Friedrich Engels. Engels was also German, like Marx, but he spent a lot of his life in England, and that's also where Marx ended up because his family were manufacturers. It's an irony of the communist movement that Engels' family were industrial capitalists, but that really Engels saw close up, and he wrote his famous book, England. The conditions of the working class in England. Anyways, he was from a bourgeois capitalist family, but he saw the conditions of the workers, and it turned him against it. Okay, but then he worked when the revolution never hit in their lifetimes, he went back to work in the factory and used the proceeds to fund the communist movement. Fascinating detail from history. I'm here on page 212. I'm going to read Engels' quote here, describing why did all these intelligent people miss all this? Because they themselves never worked with their hands. They were always of this upper class that didn't have to work, so they just assumed that the feats of the brain were happening before the feats of the hands and the body and so on, when that wasn't the case. Okay, all merit for the swift advance of civilization was ascribed to the mind. This is wrong, though. This is Engels explaining the class bias of the intelligentsia since Plato. All intellectuals to now, okay, have this bias against work, against manual labor. To the development and activity of the brain, men became accustomed to explain their actions from their thoughts instead of from their needs. And so there arose, in the course of time, that idealistic outlook on the world, which, especially since the downfall of the ancient world, has dominated men's minds. It still rules them to such a degree that even the most materialistic natural scientists of the Darwinian school are still unable to form any clear idea of the origin of man, because under the ideological influence, they do not recognize the part that has been played therein by labor. They think only the mind is creating, and actually the mind is just barking orders, and then the workers go and carry it out with their hands. And then just a little bit from Gould at the bottom of 212. Engels' theme of the separation of head and hand has done much to set and limit the course of science throughout history. Academic science, in particular, has been constrained by an ideal of pure research, which in former days barred a scientist from extensive experimentation and empirical testing. Ancient science labored under the restriction of the patrician thinkers, could not perform the manual work of plebeian artists. And then Gould shows here how in some cases, the thinkers were totally wrong, and the people actually out doing the work, even though they didn't have the fancy education and so on, they were learning more from doing and trying and trial and error and so on. So for example, he says here, medieval barber surgeons who had to deal with battlefield casualties did more to advance the practice of medicine than academic physicians, who rarely examined patients and who based their treatment on the knowledge of Galen and other learned texts. Even today, pure researchers tend to disparage the practical, and terms such as Aggie School, as in agriculture, or Cow College, are heard with distressing frequency in academic circles. This is even a thing with a bias against community colleges, right? Because you guys are often training to do something like nursing and so on. It's not a pure research institution at the community college. So why it costs less? Why the degree matters less than some snob at Harvard and so on? It took Engels' message to heart. If we took Engels' message to heart and recognized our belief in the inherent superiority, in the inherent superiority of pure research for what it is, namely a prejudice, a social prejudice, then we might forge among scientists the union between theory and practice that a world teetering dangerously near the brink so desperately needs. And he's really right on there. The world is in a crisis, not just the one we're currently dealing with, but of course climate change is an even greater crisis, where scientists have been very reluctant to get involved in the practical, in what should be done. How do we transition to carbon and so on? That's considered politics and so on. And if they get there, they get their hands dirty and they lose credibility and so on. But it's going to become necessary soon if we want our world to continue as it is. So I'm going to come back with just a lecture on Marx, and I'll bring up Kropotkin and the crackpot. The essay Kropotkin was no crackpot, when I come back at you with a lecture on my hero, the greatest of all critics, in a class where I'm trying to teach you to be a critic, the greatest of all critics, Karl Marx. Okay.